Jake Morrison had perfected the art of being thoroughly unimpressed with life. At 32, he'd seen enough broken washing machines, busted air conditioners, and malfunctioning microwaves to know that everything eventually falls apart. Just like his marriage, his credit score, and his faith in humanity's collective intelligence. He rolled out from under Mrs. Patterson's ancient dryer, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. The thing wheezed like a chain-smoking asthmatic, but it would limp along for another few months. Good enough. Ray. That'll be $60, Jake announced, standing up and immediately regretting it, as his back reminded him why 32 wasn't the new 25. Mrs. Patterson, all 4'11" of her, clutched her purse like Jake might snatch it and run. $60? For 20 minutes of work? 20 minutes of work and 32 years of experience, Jake replied, his tone flat as roadkill. Plus the cost of not having to buy a new dryer, which would run you about $800. But hey, what do I know? I'm just the guy who fixed your problem. She paid him with the enthusiasm of someone getting a root canal, muttering about highway robbery and the good old days when repairmen had moral fiber. Jake pocketed the cash and headed back to his trailer, dodging the ongoing drama between his neighbors. To his left, Eddie was explaining to anyone within earshot why the government was putting mind control chips in breakfast cereal. To his right, Miss Ruby was practicing her accordion, apparently preparing for a polka apocalypse. Behind him, the Hendersons were having their daily screaming match about whose turn it was to feed their 17 cats. Paradise. Jake's trailer sat at the end of the row like a metal monument to mediocrity. The screen door hung slightly askew, the steps wobbled, and the whole thing had the architectural charm of a shipping container that had given up on life. But it was his shipping container, and the rent was cheap. He cracked open a beer and settled into his lawn chair, the kind that came free with a gas station fill-up and looked every bit as classy as it sounded. The Nevada desert stretched out before him, all dust and disappointment under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to be blue or just give up entirely. This was it. This was his life. Fixing other people's broken crap during the day, sitting alone with cheap beer at night, rinse and repeat until death or lottery ticket salvation. Neither seemed particularly likely. The funny thing was, Jake hadn't always been this way. Once upon a time, he'd been the guy who helped old ladies cross streets, who volunteered at animal shelters, who genuinely believed people were basically good. Then life had happened. Divorce papers happened. Bills happened. Reality happened, and it had all the subtlety of a brick to the face. But sometimes, late at night when the beer hit just right and the desert wind carried away the sound of his neighbor's various neuroses, Jake could still remember what it felt like to think the world might be worth saving. Those moments usually lasted about as long as it took for someone to start another argument about property lines or for his back to remind him that crawling under appliances wasn't a young man's game anymore. Still, somewhere deep down, buried under layers of cynicism and scar tissue, that old Jake Morrison was still there. The one who'd give you his last dollar if you really needed it, even while complaining about how stupid you were for needing it in the first place. Not that anyone would ever find out. Jake had a reputation to maintain, after all. 5 years ago, Jake had been a different kind of miserable. Freshly divorced, recently unemployed, and sporting the kind of emotional baggage that required its own zip code. He'd driven his beat-up Ford into the desert with nothing but a cooler of beer, a sleeping bag, and a vague plan to figure out what the hell to do with the rest of his life. The camping trip was supposed to be therapeutic. You know, communing with nature, finding inner peace, all that self-help book garbage his ex-wife had been constantly spouting. Instead, it was mostly just him sitting around a campfire, drinking beer, and having one-sided conversations with the stars about how everything sucked. On the second night, he'd heard something that didn't belong. A low, pained sound coming from a cluster of rocks about 50 yards from his campsite. Jake's first instinct was to ignore it. Desert animals were perfectly capable of handling their own problems, and he had enough of his own to worry about. But the sound continued, and something about it tugged at whatever was left of his conscience. With a sigh that could have powered a small windmill, Jake grabbed his flashlight and went to investigate. What he found didn't make sense. Wedged between two boulders was what looked like a massive lizard, easily 6 feet long, with scales that seemed to shift color in the flashlight beam. One of its wings was bent at an unnatural angle, and there was a gash along its side that looked pretty serious. "Well, hell," Jake muttered, "because that's what you say when you find an injured dragon in the desert and your brain hasn't quite caught up to the impossibility of the situation." The creature's eyes opened, and Jake found himself staring into something that was definitely not reptilian intelligence. These were ancient eyes, intelligent eyes, eyes that seemed to see right through his soul and find it wanting. Which, to be fair, wasn't entirely inaccurate. "Easy there, buddy," Jake said, the same tone he'd used with a spooked horse. "I'm not going to hurt you." The creature made a sound that might have been communication or might have been pain. Jake chose to interpret it as the former. Now, the smart thing would have been to back away slowly, drive to the nearest town, and let someone else deal with whatever this thing was. But Jake had never been accused of being particularly smart, and something about the creature's obvious pain overrode his survival instincts. He spent the next 3 hours playing desert veterinarian. He cleaned the wound with bottled water and antiseptic from his first aid kit, fashioned a splint for the wing using tent stakes and duct tape, and even shared his beef jerky when the creature looked hungry. All while maintaining a running commentary about how this was definitely the weirdest thing that had ever happened to him, and considering his marriage, that was saying something. The creature seemed to understand him, tilting its head when he spoke and making soft sounds that almost sounded like responses. When Jake ran out of medical supplies, he sat back and cracked open another beer. "Well, that's about all I can do for you, pal," he said. "You're going to have to take it from here." The creature looked at him for a long moment, then did something that made Jake's beer-addled brain stutter to a halt. It spoke. "Nellie. Your kindness will not be forgotten, Jake Morrison." The voice was like distant thunder, layered with harmonics that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jake blinked, shook his head, and looked at his beer suspiciously. "I am Zephyr of the Drakmari," the creature continued. "I owe you a debt that will be repaid when the time comes." Jake said, because eloquence had apparently left the building along with his sanity. "Sure thing, buddy. You just get better, okay?" The creature's form began to shimmer, like heat waves rising from desert asphalt. "The stars remember kindness, Jake Morrison, as do I." And then it was gone. Not disappeared, not vanished, just gone, like it had never been there at all. Jake sat in the desert silence, staring at the empty space between the rocks, wondering if he'd finally cracked under the pressure of his imploding life. By morning, he'd convinced himself it was a stress-induced hallucination brought on by too much beer and too little sleep. The kind of thing that happened when your life fell apart and your brain decided to take a little vacation from reality. He packed up his camp, drove back to civilization, and never spoke of it again. After all, who would believe him? He barely believed it himself. 5 years later, Jake was elbowed deep in the Henderson's garbage disposal when the world decided to lose its collective mind. It started with the emergency broadcast system shrieking from every TV, radio, and phone within a 50-mile radius. Jake pulled his arm out of the sink, wiped his hands on his work shirt, and wandered outside to see what fresh hell was being unleashed on humanity this time. The sky looked wrong. That was his first thought. Above the major cities visible on the horizon, massive shapes hung in the air like storm clouds with serious commitment issues. Ships. Honest to God, science fiction movie, we come in peace shoot to kill alien ships. Well, Jake said to nobody in particular, that's new. His neighbors had emerged from their trailers like prairie dogs sensing a predator. Eddie was already shouting about how he'd been right all along about the government conspiracy, though he seemed unclear on whether this validated or invalidated his breakfast cereal theory. Miss Ruby had stopped practicing her accordion, which was probably the first sign of the apocalypse anyone had noticed. The Hendersons were too busy arguing about whether this counted as an act of God for insurance purposes to properly panic. Jake's phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking. Massive alien vessels appear over major population centers worldwide. Military forces mobilizing. Citizens advised to remain calm and stay indoors. Remain calm, Jake snorted. Because that's what humans do best when faced with the unknown. Especially when the unknown is parking spaceships over our heads like they're comparison shopping for planets. The news was full of the usual suspects doing what they did best, and politicians promising swift action while obviously having no idea what action to take. Military officials using a lot of words to say absolutely nothing. Experts explaining things they clearly didn't understand. And everyone, absolutely everyone, managing to make the situation sound both terrifying and boring at the same time. It's probably nothing, Jake muttered, heading back inside to finish the Henderson job. Government's probably just testing some new drones or something. Make a big show, get everyone worked up then. The knock on his door interrupted his rationalization. It was a polite knock, the kind that suggested the knocker had been raised with good manners and possibly a finishing school education. Not the kind of knock you expected during an alien invasion. Jake opened the door and found himself face to face with something that made his brain perform an emergency shutdown and restart procedure. It was definitely the creature from the desert, Zephyr. But bigger now, maybe 12 feet tall, with scales that caught the desert sunlight like liquid metal, wings that could have provided shade for a small aircraft, and those same ancient intelligent eyes that had watched him patch up a wounded lizard 5 years ago. "Hello, Jake Morrison," Zephyr said in that same thunderous voice, now coming from a creature that could probably use Jake's trailer as a toothpick. "I have come to repay my debt." Behind Jake, he could hear his neighbor's various reactions. Eddie screaming about alien breakfast cereal. Miss Ruby playing what sounded like a funeral dirge on her accordion. The Hendersons arguing about whether dragon insurance was covered under their homeowner's policy. "You've got to be kidding me," Jake said, because in the face of the impossible, sarcasm was really all he had left. "I do not comprehend the concept of kidding," Zephyr replied seriously. "The Galactic Council has declared your species unworthy of continued existence. However, I owe you a debt of honor. This debt now extends to your entire species." Jake blinked. "My entire species?" "Indeed. Because I gave you some first aid and beef jerky. Your kindness was freely given when you had no obligation to help and no knowledge of what I was. Such actions are rare in the galaxy." "Right?" Jake rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building that had nothing to do with the morning's beer and everything to do with cosmic responsibility. "So, just to be clear, you're telling me that humanity is about to be wiped out by some kind of galactic homeowners association, but you're here to return a favor." "That is an accurate, if simplified, assessment." Jake looked at the massive dragon standing in his doorway, then at the alien ships hanging in the sky like a sword of Damocles with serious commitment issues. Then back at the dragon. "This is just perfect," he said. Zephyr had to duck to get inside Jake's trailer, which resulted in a 12-foot dragon folding himself into a space designed for someone half his height and infinitely less scaly. It was like watching origami, if origami involved potentially world-ending aliens and a serious risk of structural damage to your home. "Your dwelling is compact," Zephyr observed diplomatically. "It's a trailer," Jake said, clearing beer cans off his kitchen table. "Not exactly built for entertaining cosmic entities. You want some coffee? I've got instant." "I do not require sustenance, but I appreciate the offer." Jake made coffee anyway, because some situations required caffeine, and finding out you're humanity's last hope definitely qualified. Outside, he could hear the news helicopters buzzing around like angry wasps, probably trying to get footage of the dragon, who was currently rearranging his furniture by existing. "So," Jake said, settling into his chair with a mug that proclaimed him the world's most adequate employee, "but explain to me how we got from me bandaging your wing to the end of the world." Zephyr's massive head tilted thoughtfully. "The Galactic Council is composed of 17 civilizations, each representing thousands of worlds. We monitor developing species for signs of worthiness." "Worthiness for what?" "Continued existence." Jake nearly choked on his coffee. "That's a hell of a performance review. Your species has been observed for approximately 50 of your years. The consensus is that humans are destructive, wasteful, and lack the capacity for meaningful growth. The decision to cleanse your world was unanimous. Cleanse. Jake set down his mug. That's a nice euphemism for genocide. The council prefers cosmic gardening, Zephyr said with what might have been embarrassment. Dead worlds can be reseeded with more promising species. Cosmic gardening. Right. Jake laughed, but it wasn't a particularly happy sound. So what changed? Why are you here, instead of helping with the pruning? Zephyr's scales shifted color, cycling through what Jake was beginning to recognize as emotional states. The Drakmari have strict codes of honor regarding debts. When I crashed on your world, I was young, inexperienced, and far from home. I expected to die in your desert. But you didn't. Because you helped me. You asked for nothing in return, expected no reward, and risked your own safety to aid a creature you didn't understand. Such behavior is uncommon in the galaxy. Jake snorted. You obviously haven't met many humans. On the contrary, I have observed thousands. Most would have either fled or attempted to capture me for profit. You simply helped because it was the right thing to do. Yeah, well, I was drunk and recently divorced. My judgment was questionable. Your judgment was pure, Zephyr corrected. And now, by the laws of my people, your debt extends to your species. I am bound to advocate for humanity before the council. Jake stared at the dragon, who was somehow managing to look apologetic despite being a 12-foot-tall death machine. Let me get this straight. You're going to tell the galactic equivalent of the Supreme Court that humanity deserves to live, because one bitter mechanic gave you some antiseptic and shared his beef jerky? Essentially, yes. And you think this is going to work? Zephyr's silence was answer enough. This is insane, Jake muttered, refilling his coffee mug. This is absolutely, completely, utterly insane. The fate of the entire human race is going to depend on my character reference? The Drakmari do not enter into debts lightly, Zephyr said. If I speak for your species, the council must listen. Whether they will be persuaded, he trailed off diplomatically. Jake looked out his window at the alien ships hanging in the sky like a cosmic game of Damocles. Somewhere out there, beings with the power to end worlds were making decisions about humanity's future. And apparently Jake Morrison, professional repair guy and amateur cynic, was about to become their defense attorney. Well, he said finally, this is just perfect. The council mothership turned out to be exactly what Jake expected from a civilization advanced enough to casually commit planetary genocide, imposing, sterile, and designed by someone who'd never heard of the concept of cozy. The corridors were vast enough to accommodate beings much larger than humans, which Jake supposed made sense when your membership included species that could probably use Earth as a footstool. Zephyr had insisted on proper dress for the occasion, which apparently meant Jake should wear his least stained work shirt and his only pair of jeans without holes. It was like getting dressed for a job interview where the job was continued existence of your species. And the dress code was business casual apocalypse. The council chamber was a circular amphitheater that could have housed a small stadium. Representatives from 17 different civilizations sat in judgment, and Jake had to admit, it was an impressive collection of evolutionary diversity. There were beings that looked like walking crystals, others that resembled octopi with philosophy degrees, and at least one that appeared to be a sentient gas cloud with attitude. At the center of it all stood a podium that looked like it had been designed to make whoever stood behind it feel as small and insignificant as possible. Mission accomplished. The council recognizes Zephyr of the Drakmari, announced a voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once, who claims debt right on behalf of the species designated as human. Zephyr stepped forward with the kind of dignity that came from being a 12-foot dragon with excellent posture. Honored council, I present Jake Morrison, representative of humanity, as evidence of his species' worthiness. Jake looked around the chamber at beings who could probably rearrange solar systems as a hobby. Hi, he said, because when you're about to defend your entire species, you might as well start with the basics. A collective rustling went through the chamber. Apparently, hi wasn't standard galactic protocol. You are the human who aided Zephyr? This from a being that looked like a walking collection of geometric shapes with a superiority complex. Yeah, that's me. Jake Morrison, professional fixer of broken things and amateur savior of lost dragons. He gestured to Zephyr, though to be fair, I thought he was just a really big lizard at the time. The Council has observed your species for 50 rotations, announced another representative, this one resembling a tree with trust issues. We have documented constant warfare, environmental destruction, and systematic oppression of your own kind. What possible defense can you offer for such behavior? Jake looked around the chamber, took a deep breath, and decided that if humanity was going down, they might as well go down swinging. You want to know what's wrong with humans? He said. Everything. We're violent, we're stupid, we're self-destructive. And we have an amazing talent for making bad situations worse. We fight wars over resources while living on a planet that is plenty for everyone. We pollute our own water, and then act surprised when we get sick. We create incredible art, and then bomb museums. We're walking contradictions wrapped in skin suits and bad decisions. The chamber fell silent. This was apparently not the defense strategy they'd expected. But here's the thing, Jake continued, warming to his theme. All that stuff you think makes us unworthy? That's exactly what makes us worth saving. You want to know why I helped Zephyr? Because he was hurt and I could help. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't some grand philosophical decision. It was just a guy seeing something that needed fixing and having the tools to fix it. This is your defense? The crystal being sounded incredulous. That humans help other humans? No, Jake said. My defense is that humans help. Period. We help when it's stupid. We help when it's dangerous. We help when it doesn't benefit us at all. We run into burning buildings to save people we've never met. We jump into rivers to rescue drowning strangers. We donate organs to people we'll never see again. We do it because something inside us can't stand to see suffering and do nothing about it. He pointed to Zephyr. I helped him because he needed help. Not because I knew he was some kind of galactic nobility. Not because I expected a reward, but because he was hurt and I happened to be there with a first aid kit and too much beer. And yet, said the gas cloud entity, your species continues to wage war, to destroy, to harm one another. Yeah, we do, Jake admitted, because we're also scared and angry and confused most of the time. We're barely out of the caves, cosmically speaking. We're still figuring out how to be people, let alone how to be good people. But the fact that we're trying, that we keep trying even when we fail, that's got to count for something. He looked around the chamber at beings who had presumably evolved past humanity's petty concerns. You guys probably figured out peace and harmony and universal healthcare thousands of years ago. Good for you. But I bet you didn't do it overnight. I bet you had wars and famines and really awkward teenage phases as species too. The difference is, nobody was standing over you with a cosmic clipboard, grading your progress and threatening to wipe you out if you didn't meet expectations. The Council ensures galactic stability, the tree thing said stiffly. The Council ensures galactic conformity, Jake shot back. You want every species to be just like you, fully evolved and properly civilized. But maybe the galaxy needs a few rough edges. Maybe it needs some folks who are still stupid enough to run toward danger instead of away from it. Maybe it needs species who haven't learned better than to help strangers for no good reason. He gestured toward the viewing ports, where Earth hung like a blue marble in the void. We're not perfect. Hell, we're not even close. But we're trying, and we're learning, and occasionally we do something right. Give us time, and we might surprise you. Wipe us out now, and you'll never know what we might have become. The chamber fell silent again, but this time it felt different, thoughtful, maybe. Or maybe Jake was just projecting, because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. The Council will deliberate, announced the voice from everywhere. The human will wait. And so Jake Morrison, professional repair guy and amateur defender of humanity, found himself cooling his heels in a cosmic waiting room, hoping that his species' greatest strength wasn't also going to be their epitaph. The council deliberated for what felt like geological ages but was probably only about 20 minutes. Jake spent the time pacing around the waiting area, which was apparently designed by the same people who did DMV offices throughout the galaxy, uncomfortable seating, and fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they were dying, and a complete absence of reading material that wasn't in alien languages. Zephyr had remained silent throughout the wait, but Jake could see the tension in the dragon's massive frame. Even cosmic honor codes apparently came with no guarantees, and the weight of an entire species' survival was enough to make anyone nervous. When they were finally called back into the chamber, Jake felt like he was walking to his own execution. Except instead of just him dying, it would be everyone he'd ever known, plus about 8 billion people he'd never met but was apparently representing. No pressure. The crystal being served as spokesperson, its faceted surface catching the chamber's light in patterns that probably meant something profound to someone who understood crystalline body language. The council has reached a decision, it announced, and Jake's heart tried to relocate itself somewhere in the vicinity of his throat. The species designated as human will be granted a probationary period of 100 rotations to demonstrate their capacity for growth and worthiness. Jake blinked. Probationary period? Your words were... Illuminating, the tree entity said, sounding like it was admitting to an embarrassing personal secret. The council acknowledges that perhaps our standards have been overly rigid. Young species require time to mature. However, the gas cloud added, because there's always a however, this probation requires oversight. A liaison between humanity and the galactic community must be established to monitor your progress and provide guidance. Jake nodded. That made sense. Some kind of alien ambassador, probably. Someone with diplomatic training and an understanding of interstellar politics. Someone who knew how to navigate the complex web of galactic civilization without accidentally starting wars or insulting powerful beings who could turn planets into cosmic dust. We designate Jake Morrison as this liaison, the crystal being announced. I'm sorry, what now? Jake said, certain he'd misheard. Your defense of your species demonstrates both understanding of human nature and the ability to communicate effectively with galactic representatives, Zephyr explained. And Jake could swear the dragon looked amused. You are uniquely qualified for this position. I fix appliances for a living, Jake protested. I live in a trailer park. I have a high school education and a drinking problem. I am possibly the least qualified person on the planet for this job. And yet, said the octopus thing, you successfully argued for your species' survival before a council that had already decided on extinction. Perhaps your qualifications are more extensive than you realize. An hour later, Jake found himself back in his trailer, staring at what the council had cheerfully called his diplomatic kit but which looked suspiciously like a cosmic smartphone crossed with a medical tricorder and a really expensive coffee maker. Apparently, it would allow him to communicate with the council, monitor humanity's progress, and provide guidance on galactic protocols. The alien ships had departed, leaving behind only a few smaller vessels to begin the process of cultural integration, which, according to the manual that had materialized along with his new job, meant that Earth was about to get some new neighbors. Alien refugees, exchange students, and tourists who wanted to experience the charm of a developing civilization. His first official diplomatic crisis came about 10 minutes after the ships left, when Eddie knocked on his door to complain that the aliens were interfering with his television reception and could Jake please ask them to move their spaceships. Eddie, Jake said, looking at his neighbor who was wearing a tinfoil hat that appeared to be homemade. You realize that I'm supposed to be representing humanity to advanced galactic civilizations, right? And you want me to file a noise complaint about their parking? It's not about the parking, Eddie said seriously. It's about the principle. This is America, Jake. We have rights. And that, Jake realized, was going to be his life now, mediating between cosmic entities and trailer park residents. explaining human nature to beings who'd transcended physical existence while simultaneously explaining galactic law to people who still argued about whether professional wrestling was real. That evening, as he sat in his lawn chair watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and amber, Jake reflected on how dramatically his life had changed. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern had been whether Mrs. Patterson would pay her repair bill on time. Now he was responsible for humanity's relationship with the galaxy. Zephyr materialized beside him, somehow managing to fold his 12-foot frame into a lawn chair that creaked ominously but held. "Having second thoughts?" the dragon asked. "Third, fourth, and fifth thoughts," Jake admitted. "But I guess someone has to do it, and apparently the universe thinks that someone is me." "The universe has a sense of humor," Zephyr observed. "The universe has a seriously twisted sense of humor," Jake corrected. "But I suppose it beats fixing garbage disposals for a living." In the distance, he could see the lights of the first alien settlement being established just outside of town. In a few months, there would probably be interstellar tourists coming to Earth to experience authentic human culture, which meant he'd probably have to explain to beings from advanced civilizations why humans put pineapple on pizza and why reality television existed. "You know what the really funny part is?" Jake said, cracking open a beer and offering one to Zephyr, who politely declined. "5 years ago, I was just a guy with a busted marriage and a bad attitude, camping in the desert and feeling sorry for myself. Now I'm humanity's liaison to the galactic community, and it all started because I couldn't ignore a hurt animal." "Perhaps," Zephyr said thoughtfully, "that says something important about both you and your species." Jake considered this, watching as Miss Ruby emerged from her trailer to serenade the alien settlement with what sounded like a polka version of Welcome to the Jungle. In the distance, he could see the Hendersons setting up a lemonade stand with a sign that read "Alien Refreshments, Cash Only." "Yeah," he said finally, raising his beer in a toast to the cosmos. "We're definitely going to keep things interesting." And somewhere in the vastness of space, the Galactic Council probably had no idea what they'd just gotten themselves into. But Jake Morrison, professional repair guy and amateur cosmic diplomat, was about to show them that sometimes the best way to fix the galaxy was to embrace the beautiful chaos of being human. After all, he'd always been good at fixing broken things. The galaxy just happened to be his biggest repair job yet.